1984 is a book about totalitarianism. It is set in an alternative London which is ruled by the one-party state of Oceania, one of three vast superstates that dominate the planet. The plot is focused on the experience of Winston Smith, an everyman character. Winston is 39 years old at the beginning of the novel and works in the Ministry of Truth. His job is to change publications and other information to conform to the current party line. For example, if a newspaper article from a year before does not tally with what Big Brother says presently, it's not Big Brother, but the article itself that must be altered. Winston is one of many so-called outer party members who work on such things. Winston himself is a member of this rough middle class of Oceanian society, a group of heavily controlled individuals who execute the policies and run the state apparatus itself under the direction of both Big Brother and the ruling inner party. Winston lives a miserable existence in a run-down apartment, drinking vile-tasting gin and eating horrid meals in a community canteen with his fellow party members. He lives alone and is seemingly a lone voice in his own rebellious thoughts in a world where even thought itself is, in theory, heavily controlled by the concepts of doublethink and also Crime Stop. At the opening of the story, Winston starts to keep a diary in which he relates significant events in his own life. This act, in and of itself, is a serious offence in the totalitarian society of Oceania. As well as the general poverty, deception and oppression, the citizens of Oceania also live under the leadership of Big Brother. Paradoxically, both the shadowy figurehead of the party, who is never physically seen, but also the centre of an all-encompassing cult of personality. Big Brother's visage and voice are ubiquitous. His face is plastered across London and Oceania generally. His hypnotic stare is an enduring menace or reassurance, depending on one's perspective. Big Brother's face is on posters, telescreens, and even the currency that are the ordinary objects of Winston's general existence. Book 1 is essentially Orwell's world-building phase of the book. We follow Winston as he relates his experiences through the diary he keeps, and also his own private rebellion, or rather expansion of it. Winston relates that he has always had unorthodox thoughts, thought crimes as the party terms them, or private musings and ideas that do not conform to the party line. In Book 1, Winston is very much an isolated rebel against the party. At this stage, we find out that he has a particular interest in two people, the other main characters of the plot. The first is a woman some years younger than him, a dark-haired, attractive girl who we later find out works in PornSec, the department of the Ministry of Truth that creates pornographic material for prole use. Winston is initially afraid of her due to the tendency of such women to be among the most fanatical adherents to the party. We later find out her name is Julia, though Orwell never reveals her surname. Winston suspects she may be secretly following him, suspecting he has unorthodox tendencies. When he visits a prole shop, another dodgy act, he finds her indeed following him, contemplates killing her before she can denounce him. Winston is both attracted to, but also repulsed by Julia simultaneously. The second individual Winston is interested in is O'Brien. O'Brien is a member of the inner party, the ruling elite of Oceania, and so we might assume Winston is similarly wary of him. Winston, however, suspects that O'Brien himself has heretical tendencies, or could at least understand Winston's own thoughts and perspective. Winston's personal journey continues until a breakthrough moment in which his own personal and private rebellion evolves into an interpersonal one. Julia in fact reveals herself to be just as unorthodox in her own way. One day she manages to slip Winston a note under the pretext of helping her up after a fall, the simple contents of which blow his mind. The words "I love you" spark a highly dangerous affair throughout Book 2 that both excites and makes Winston and Julia very happy. Such a relationship between party members is an unforgivable transgression, as are most things associated with a personal life which are not directly tied to serving the party. Eventually, the couple settle into a hiding place in a room above an old junk shop owned by a certain Mr. Charrington. With no telescreen to observe them, Winston and Julia continue their relationship, eventually taking things politically to the next step. Winston has always pondered whether wider resistance to Big Brother and the party is a thing, or if a full-blown resistance movement called the Brotherhood really exists. When O'Brien approaches him with a hint that this is so, Winston and Julia visit his apartment and seem to have this confirmed. Both Winston and Julia eagerly join the so-called Brotherhood, O'Brien acting as their contact. As part of the initiation into the rebel group, Winston has covertly smuggled a copy of a book called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, supposedly written by Manuel Goldstein, an early leader of the party who became a rival to Big Brother himself and was subsequently condemned and forced into exile. Through this book, Winston and we are further informed about the nature of Oceanian and world society. We learn why Oceanian society is structured so, as well as the reason for the endless war waged between the three superstates of the world. The end of Book 2 unfortunately sees both Winston and Julia's luck run out. Having once more retired to their room, they are finally cornered and captured by the Fort Police. Book 3 follows the gruesome events of Winston's initial capture and eventual reintegration into Oceanian society. One scary truth Winston learns is just how powerful and pervasive the party and Fort Police are. Both Mr. Charrington, a seemingly benign old man who owned the shop under Winston's room, as well as O'Brien himself, were in fact agents of the Fort Police, totally loyal to Big Brother. Book 3 hosts some of the more infamous scenes of the novel. Winston is beaten and broken down through relentless questioning and humiliations. Through interrogation sessions that last from weeks to months, O'Brien breaks down Winston psychologically, eroding his heretical beliefs. For example, that the past exists independent of party manipulation. Broken both physically and psychologically, Winston's transition from rebellious individual to good-thinking party member is completed by the close of the book. O'Brien and the party use Winston's phobia of rats to break him completely in a place called Room 101, the area of the Ministry of Love where each dissident faces their worst and unendurable fear. The last shred of individual rebellion is Winston's love for Julia. Though Julia herself was quickly broken and remoulded into a good party member, Winston himself is forced to no longer love her finally when a cage containing rats is attached to his face. The implication being that barring the suitable response, they would be set upon him. Completely losing it, Winston screams, "Do it to Julia," and so the love he feels for her is finally stripped from him. The last obstacle to Winston's full submission is removed. The novel ends with Winston released, sitting in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. Having met Julia again, both are revealed as hollowed out, good thoughtful party members, totally uninterested in rekindling their illicit relationship. At the very end, Winston gazes on the face of Big Brother one final time. Despite his earlier hatred, is revealed to genuinely love him. 1984 is a horrific account of how anyone can be transformed and dominated by the state. The party is shown as all-powerful, with telescreens monitoring all outer party members constantly. At one stage, it's even demonstrated that a person's very thoughts can be discerned, a dreadful degree of control. 1984 showcases how state power can be boosted to near omnipotent levels, but it's also a tale of hope, given it shows just how difficult it is and to what crazy lengths the state has to go to achieve complete and absolute control over the individual. Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today I cover the named characters of the novel, explaining who each are and what they're doing. We shall descend in significance, beginning of course with the main characters and finishing with the more obscure ones. Since I am covering only named individuals, I may overlook other memorable minor characters, which I'm sure will be covered in some form in another video. Winston Smith is the 39-year-old protagonist of the story and begins the book by opening a diary. Winston is an everyman character intended to be our eyes and ears into the world of Oceania. He is a lean, fair-faced, rather intellectual and brooding type of man who works in the Ministry of Truth, one of the 4 ministries of Oceania. His job is specifically in the records department as a clerk, who rectifies or changes public records to accord with the current party truth. Though on the surface Winston plays the part of a dutiful party member and worker, he secretly hates both the party and Big Brother and seeks to explore the real past beyond the party history. He is fascinated with the abolished past and eventually moves from thought crime alone and writing in his diary to conducting an affair with fellow party member Julia. He and Julia carry on their secret and forbidden love affair, seemingly under the nose of the Thought Police, and after Winston is one day approached by O'Brien, he eventually meets with him, accompanied by Julia in his flat. This is seemingly to join the so-called Brotherhood, a shadowy opposition group led by Emmanuel Goldstein, that seeks to bring down the party. Alas, both Winston and Julia are eventually caught and arrested, but not before Winston has much of his suspicions concerning the mechanisms of party control confirmed in Goldstein's book. Winston is tortured by O'Brien and the Thought Police in the Ministry of Love, eventually warped into loving and not hating Big Brother. In the process, he is also broken completely in Room 101, where he is forced to face the most terrible thing in the world, for him, rats. Here his love for Julia is also forever severed. Winston finally ends the novel a broken and hollowed out man. Nothing of his former self remains, and he is a loyal party member who loves Big Brother. Julia is another of the main 3 characters of the book and is the lover of Winston Smith. She is 26 years old and works as a mechanic on the novel writing machines in the fiction department of the Ministry of Truth. At first, Winston hates her, though is somewhat attracted to her, given she appears the sort of fanatical younger party member who would gladly turn him in to the Thought Police. Julia is superficially a model party member. She is a member of the Junior Anti-Sex League, a group who advocates for complete and universal celibacy for all party members. She conspicuously wears the scarlet sash of the League around her waist. Julia works long hours and works even more hours in her free time to help disseminate Junior Anti-Sex League posters and propaganda. One day she stages a fall near Winston and smuggles him a note that reads, "I love you." From this initial contact, a full-blown love affair ensues, revealing Julia to be anything but a good party member. Julia has had other lovers, her first affair being at age 16 with a party member of 60. Julia is politically apathetic, initially refusing to believe that the Brotherhood exists, and even questioning if the war itself is real. She defies the party for her own secret life and pleasure, not for political purposes or to overthrow it, which she sees as rather silly. She develops a mutual love for Winston as their affair progresses. Unfortunately for her, her latest affair would prove her undoing. She is arrested along with Winston and taken to the Ministry of Love. She too emerges from her experience there as a broken woman, her love for Winston permanently destroyed. Though Julia is politically uninterested, falling to sleep invariably when Winston insists on talking about politics or ideology, she was, however, capable of great insight and intelligence when it came to her own life and sexuality, hence Winston's sarcastic nickname for her, the Rebel from the waist down. Julia's surname is never revealed to us. O'Brien is the third and final main character of the novel, and later revealed to be the main antagonist. He spends most of the novel as a mysterious and magnetic character, a focus of Winston's hopes and fantasies about a secret group dedicated to the overthrow of Big Brother and the party. O'Brien is a few years older than Winston, though his exact age is never stated, and he is a member of the Inner Party. This makes him part of the elite, the rulers of Oceania, and so a person Winston should naturally fear. O'Brien, however, has a curious way about him, a noble bearing that contrasts with his impressive physicality. He also seems to Winston like he could be a secret thought criminal too. Eventually, in the second part of the novel, O'Brien approaches Winston with the excuse of offering him a look at the latest Newspeak dictionary, and the two, along with Julia, meet in his home. Here, all of Winston's secret hopes are apparently confirmed. O'Brien inducts him and Julia into the Brotherhood and arranges for Smith to receive a copy of Goldstein's book, which explains why their world is the way it is. O'Brien, however, is later revealed to be a double agent, totally loyal to both the party and Big Brother. He personally oversees Winston's interrogation in the Ministry of Love, helping to intellectually and emotionally break down Winston, so that by the time the latter is confronted with Room 101, he succeeds in severing Winston's love for Julia and in forcing Winston to eventually and willingly love and not hate Big Brother. O'Brien's first name is never revealed in the book, though it may indicate he is of Irish extraction, though this is not relevant to the plot. O'Brien has a larger-than-life bearing and a certain charisma that attracts those around him, with even Julia seemingly impressed in their meeting. He is also distinguished for his great intellect and steely commitment to the principles of Ingsoc. Now we move on to the minor characters of the book, both existent and non-existent, though the latter, apart from one named character, is still arguable, as we shall see. Big Brother is the supposed ruler of Oceania and leader of the party, one of the three characters that fall into the non-existent category. His non-existence is the closest to certain, given Goldstein's book, which Winston reads parts of later in the story, states that Big Brother is simply the guise in which the party wishes to present itself. The book further states that no one has ever seen him in person, that his general location is never known, and that he will likely never die, all of which indicates he is merely a fictitious symbol of the party. Big Brother, who is never given an actual name, is a voice on the telescreens and a face on posters and every other media, even on the currency. Though quite likely more an Uncle Sam or Britannia type figure, his existence is taken as a given by all right-thinkful party members. According to the official history of the party, he has been active for years, stretching back into the decades before the party achieved power, though Winston does not recall Big Brother before other prominent party members like Jones, Aronson and Rutherford. Big Brother consolidated his power as leader of the party and state by about 1970, Jones, Aronson and Rutherford being among the final leaders of the party who were purged to make way for his supposed supreme leadership. Big Brother appears as a ruggedly handsome and mustachioed man in about his middle 40s. He never appears personally at any point in the novel. Emmanuel Goldstein, in contrast to Big Brother, is the arch-traitor and devil-like figure of hatred and ridicule in Oceania. He is the evil mirror to Big Brother. Whereas the former is the source of all wisdom, safety and goodness, Goldstein leads a shadowy resistance to the party, plotting with his foreign allies to bring down the party and Big Brother. Goldstein is famously always the principal subject and speaker during the daily 2 minutes hate. Similar to Big Brother, there is a strong likelihood that he does not, in fact, exist, but is merely a fabrication, intended to be a target for the pent-up hatred and anger of the oppressed outer party and masses. According to official party history, Goldstein had once been a loyal member of the party, almost at a level with Big Brother himself, but had then betrayed BB and the revolution. He had fled before the great purges of the 1960s, the story going that he now plots the downfall of the party in exile, some say in foreign lands, but even perhaps in some secret hiding place in Oceania itself. Goldstein is, in addition, at least publicly acknowledged as the author of the in-universe book The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, the book that explains how and why oceanic society is the way it is. Later on in Winston Smith's interrogation by O'Brien, the latter reveals that he partially wrote the book, thus further casting doubt on Goldstein's existence. Goldstein is described as having a lean Jewish face and wears a pair of spectacles, having a fuzzy aureole of grey hair and a face that resembles that of a sheep. Out of universe, it's very likely he is modelled after Lev Bronstein, better known as Leon Trotsky, a famous early leader of the Soviet Union and opponent of Joseph Stalin. Mr. Charrington first appears in part 1 of the book and is the elderly owner of a junk shop in a prole quarter of London. Charrington's first name is never revealed, though he claims to be a widower and the owner of the shop for the past 3 decades. He lives alone and had sold Winston his diary before the events of the novel. Charrington serves as a precious link to the past for Winston. By the very nature of his work as an antique seller, he symbolises the past, but also sells Winston his cherished coral paperweight and shares with him bits of old rhyme that recall the old world before the revolution and the abolishment of the past. It's also Mr. Charrington who rents a room over his shop to Winston, in which the latter and Julia carry on their secret affair. In truth, however, Charrington is later dramatically revealed as very probably an agent of the Fort Police, having spied on Winston the entire time and entrapped him. He is cleverly disguised with small alterations to his face, making a complete transformation of his appearance that fools Winston and even the arguably more cautious Julia. Instead of the white-haired, feeble old man he always appeared to be, he is revealed to Winston as being a dark-haired and alert man of around 35, and almost certainly an agent of the Fort Police. Charrington serves as a frightening example of the reach, cleverness, and power of the Fort Police. Tom Parsons is an anxious and somewhat unlikable neighbour, acquaintance and work colleague of Winston Smith. At 35, he was a chubby, if active and enthusiastic party member, though not intelligent or given any great responsibility. He was a member of committees dedicated to organising demonstrations and sports events, and is outwardly a loyal and good thinkful party comrade. One thing that stands out with Parsons is his near inexhaustible capacity for sweating, which seems indicative of his anxious nature. On the surface, Parsons seems to be a good contrast to Winston, a superficially unthinking drudge of the party, who Winston is sure will never be vaporised. Parsons shares his home with an unnamed wife and 2 children. Despite his conviction about Parsons, Winston is shocked when Parsons too appears in the Ministry of Love. His crime was saying "down with Big Brother" in his sleep, an outburst that was overheard by his own daughter and reported to the patrol the next morning. Parsons seeks reassurance from Winston that the party would not shoot him and hopes instead to continue serving in a forced labour camp instead. Parsons is last seen by Winston after liberally using the only toilet in the cell they shared. His ultimate fate is not certain. Syme is another acquaintance of Winston Smith and, unlike Parsons, is closer to being a friend as much as party members could have friends. Winston, for his part, enjoys his society more than that of Parsons, and had a genuine interest in Syme when he can get him to talk about his work. Syme is a newspeak expert and continually works on updating the language, relishing in abolishing words from the English language that he and the party deems unnecessary. Syme is completely loyal to the party and orthodox intellectually, though Winston feels certain he will be vaporised by the party, given his forthright manner and clear thinking. Syme is deemed too smart for his own good, easily grasping the true purpose of newspeak, to narrow the range of thought and thus increase party control. Since the party does not like such intelligent and frank individuals, Winston predicts Syme will be vaporised, and he is proved right. Syme does eventually disappear, and his fate is ultimately unknown. Mrs. Parsons is technically a named character, though only as the wife of Tom Parsons. She is also Winston's neighbour in Victory Mansions, and suffers a dreary and terrifying existence as the mother of 2 unruly children, who are also full members of the Spies, a youth group of the party that trains kids to monitor and report on their parents about any heretical thought when suspected. Mrs. Parsons is seen during an early scene in which she asks Winston to unblock a sink. Her own hard and crushing existence are manifested in her own worn and haggard appearance. Though only a woman of about 30, she already seems far older, Winston noting she had dust in the creases of her face. Winston predicts that she and not her husband would eventually be vaporized. However, he is incorrect. In fact, her and Tom's daughter denounces Parsons, leading to Mrs. Parsons' husband being taken away to the Ministry of Love. Unfortunately, in all likelihood, it is eventually probable that one of her kids will eventually denounce her too, though her fate is unknown. Jones, Aronson and Rutherford are three minor characters who are dead by the events of the novel and were former dissidents of the party who were purged in around 1965. Not much is known about them, with some information provided about Rutherford, who most impressed Winston. Rutherford was a large man with a grey mane of hair, who Winston guesses must have been immensely strong when healthier. Rutherford had been a cartoonist and caricaturist during the earlier days of the rise of the party, but along with his colleagues Jones and Aronson had fallen out of favour. Winston recalls encountering the trio sat in the Chestnut Tree Cafe after stays in the Ministry of Love. A faint air of the old revolutionary era clung to them, and Winston ominously noted that Jones and Rutherford had broken noses. These men are significant to Winston, given they were examples of a solid tie to the past, which had been unaltered by the party. Though their arrests, trials and confessions had been publicised, Winston had encountered a photograph of the three, which proved they were present at a party function in New York at the exact date that they were supposedly in Eurasia, betraying their country. Their significance to Winston endures right into his own interrogation, where O'Brien eventually convinces Winston, through torture and mental conditioning, that their innocence was merely a legend that he created. It's also confirmed by O'Brien that the three were similarly broken down into good, thinkful, rehabilitated party members who all loved Big Brother. Catherine Smith is Winston's estranged wife. She never actually appears in the events of the novel directly, but is recalled and discussed by Winston and Julia. Catherine was a tall, fair-haired woman with a noble-like face, but as far as Winston could see, she was his mirror image in her genuine devotion to the party and Big Brother. A completely orthodox, good thinker, Winston named her the human soundtrack, he being entirely convinced there was nothing inside her head but slogans and ideas planted by the party. The two had been paired, their marriage approved by a special committee, and spent around 15 months together. Though repulsed by sex with her husband, Catherine submitted to intercourse as the couple's duty to the party. As Winston was eventually disgusted by the whole thing after a time, Catherine insisted they persevere to conceive a child. By 1984, the couple had been separated for years. Winston also recalls with Julia how one time he and his wife had been lost from a group of hikers, and he had seriously contemplated pushing Catherine off of a cliff, though he did not do so. Divorce is not permitted, and so the two are merely separated. Later on in his interrogation, Winston was forced ironically to confess to her murder, though it's unclear if Catherine is dead by this point. Ampleforth is a fellow party member and colleague of Winston's, who also works in the records department of the Ministry of Truth. His job is to rewrite politically or ideologically offensive poems from Oldspeak. He is larger than Winston and distinguished by his hairy ears. He is a gentle kind of man, similar in disposition to Parsons. He is somewhat attached to Winston in his own way, to the point that Winston believes Ampleforth would sit at his table if he spotted Winston alone. Ampleforth, like Winston, Syme, Parsons and others, also falls afoul of the party, despite his mild nature and seeming orthodoxy. Though not certain, Ampleforth suspects he was arrested because he left the word God in a poem by Kipling. This as he could not find any other rhyme with rod to replace it. Ampleforth briefly shares a cell with Winston and is thought by Winston to possibly bear the razor blade given to him by the Brotherhood. However, this is not so. Ampleforth is eventually ordered to room 101, but the details of his exact fate are unknown. Comrade Ogilvy is a non-existent man created by Winston Smith as part of his job. Ogilvy is created to account for an article formerly commending an unperson, Comrade Withers. Since Withers officially no longer exists, the article is rewritten to celebrate Ogilvy instead. Ogilvy replaces Withers in Big Brother's Order of the Day, with Winston inventing an entire backstory for the man. A good and loyal party member, Ogilvy had perished when, while flying over the Indian Ocean, he had leapt from his aircraft with important dispatches, weighing himself down with his machine gun so as to avoid capture by the enemy. Winston rewrites the offending article to have Big Brother commending the man, and satisfactorily thinks that now Ogilvy exists in records as authentically as Charlemagne or Julius Caesar. Bumstead is an outer party member briefly seen in a scene in early part 3 of the novel. He is a timid, chinless man with pouched cheeks that Winston imagines could hide little stores of food. For such a minor character, we do know that his name and number are 2713 Bumstead J, as this is roared at him from the telescreen in the cell that he, Winston and others are held in, when he offers a grimy piece of bread to a starving, skull-faced man whom he evidently pities. Bumstead is brutally punished for his pity when a large guard enters the cell and bashes his face, which causes his face to swell horribly and a dental plate to fall out. When the guards finally come for the skull-faced man, it is Bumstead that the man initially suggests the guards take to room 101 instead of him. Bumstead's fate is unknown, though his transgression with the bread likely provoked a cruel period in the Fort Police's hands, followed by his own stay in room 101. Martin appears in part 2 as the named servant of O'Brien in his home. He is a small dark-haired man with an expressionless, diamond-shaped face that Winston thinks might be Chinese. Martin never speaks during Winston's time in O'Brien's home, but does play along with events as directed by his master. Martin may be one of 2 or 3 servants particularly tied to O'Brien, as Goldstein's book, which is true as description, states that every inner party member has 2 or 3 white-jacketed servants assigned to them. Martin shows no interest or comradeship with either Winston or Julia, and appears to be just passively participating in O'Brien's deception. When he leaves, he clinically studies their faces at the order of O'Brien, and then leaves without hint of liking either of them. Even when referred to as one of us and asked to sit as an equal, Martin still has a servant-like air about him, as if merely enjoying a privilege. Winston puts this all down to Martin perhaps being a Brotherhood member who had to change his appearance surgically to escape the party. However, this is unlikely given subsequent events. Comrade Tillotson is a colleague of Winston's who has a similar job to him in the records department. He too likely amends public records to accord with the party truth, but has a secretive air about him. He always pulls his speakwrite close to him, as if trying to keep what he is saying a secret between him and it. He occasionally darts hostile glances at Winston from his workstation. Tillotson also seems to be a rival of sorts, at least from Winston's perspective, as Winston imagines that Tillotson is working on the same thing as him at one point, and that it would be his version of events that would be selected over Tillotson's. Wilshire is another co-worker of Winston. He appears very briefly. His only significance to events is when he unwittingly delays Winston's first hurried conversation with Julia after she had given the note to him some days before. Winston barely knows Wilshire, who is a young, blonde-haired and silly-faced man who happens to invite Winston to sit with him as he appears to be looking for a spot from Wilshire's point of view. For a brief time, Wilshire is hated by Winston, who imagines driving a pickaxe into his smiling face. Withers is an unperson and former prominent member of the Inner Party and one of few named individuals belonging to the group. He had headed a group called FFCC that had provided cigarettes and other comforts to the sailors of the floating fortresses, but had somehow fallen out of favour with the party and been vaporised. He had been the subject of Big Brother's Order of the Day and been awarded the Order of Conspicuous Merit, 2nd class. Withers may have been vaporised for heresy, corruption or incompetence, or simply because of his popularity. He is eventually replaced by Winston with the invented person of Comrade Ogilvy. And that's the end of the named characters. However, if you've stuck around this long, you deserve to hear the unnamed honourable mentions that are not time-stamped. There are 3 of these, and they are the prole washerwoman. She is a large, red-armed prole woman who frequently hangs clothes and diapers on a washing line below Winston and Julia's secret room. She appears to be middle-aged at least, likely a grandmother and mother, who perhaps washes and hangs clothes as a trade, given the seemingly endless amount of washing she has. Winston grows to admire this particular prole woman as a symbol of his fondly held hope that if the party can be overthrown, it's through the proles. She continually sings an artificially created song, "It Was Only an Hopeless Fancy," which Winston feels is symptomatic of how the proles lack a mind. However, he hopes one day that proles like her breed a generation of men and women capable of overthrowing the party. When Winston and Julia are taken at the end of part 2, a scream is heard from her vicinity and the washing tub is heard to clang noisily. Since black uniformed guards do swarm in from the window too, it's likely she was manhandled out of the area and possibly injured, though nothing more is known about her fate. Our second unnamed character is an old man Winston briefly befriends in a prole pub. Winston notes while in a prole district that this man is at least 80 and would have clear memories and thoughts on the world before the revolution. Winston hopes to glean some details from the man, if the world had been better or worse back in his youth, but finds only a rubbish heap of details. The man only remembers things in anecdotes about his own life and can provide no great insights in the way that Winston wants. This encounter is important as it leads Winston to risking another encounter with Charrington, which moves him in the direction of ultimate capture. Finally, and perhaps rather anticlimactically, is the so-called waxen-faced or cold-faced officer. This is a minor unnamed character encountered by Winston in his time in the Ministry of Love. He is basically the commander of the guards and presumably charged with keeping order in the cells. This young officer orders the bashing of Bumstead, as well as the consigning of the skull-faced man to room 101. The officer also made enough of an impression to be present in Winston's own demented dreams of the period, and accompanies O'Brien into the cell with his guards when confronting Winston just prior to his sentencing to room 101. So there we are, all the named characters of 1984. Welcome to 1984 lore and our brief exploration of the social hierarchy of George Orwell's dystopian world. 1984 is set in Oceania, specifically Airstrip 1, formerly known as Great Britain, and mostly within London. Here amongst the rundown ancient buildings that house the masses, tower 4 vast pyramidal structures, the 4 ministries of the ruling party. Within these work the men and women of the party who make up around 15% of the total population, and who are, in theory, the upper strata of the society. Winston Smith himself works in the Ministry of Truth, rectifying documents to conform to the current party line, and is a member of the so-called Outer Party. The party itself is divided into 2 broad groups, the Outer and Inner Party, and we shall descend from the highest echelons to the lowest as we move on. Oceania, as explored in our video on the Geopolitics of 1984, is a huge superstate that consists of Britain, the Americas, Australia, Southern Africa, and other territories. Its ruler, and at the summit of its hierarchical pyramid, is Big Brother. Big Brother is the head of state and guide of the party, who, at least superficially, rules as a godlike and revered dictator. Big Brother, commonly referred to as BB, supposedly existed as a leader of the party from its earliest days, and rose to unquestioned primacy before Winston's time. BB is at the centre of a pervasive cult of personality, which is explained as useful for the party, given feelings of reverence and love are more easily directed towards a person than a faceless institution like the party itself. Given BB is never actually seen, and the explanation of his function in the in-universe book the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism, it's likely he does not actually exist. Big Brother heads the so-called inner party that makes up just 2% of Oceanian society. Just below the summit of the hierarchical pyramid, it's likely that various inner party members occupy de facto positions of power above and beyond most others. We know that, at least earlier on according to party law, other leaders did occupy leadership positions almost at a level of BB himself. Emmanuel Goldstein, another figure whose existence is questionable, was certainly at this level, though by the year of the plot he had become an enemy of the state and was expelled from the party long ago. However, even so, this does show that other prominent leaders did and perhaps still do exist at the top levels of the inner party, though by 1984 under the unquestioned overall leadership of BB himself. Jones, Aronson and Rutherford are three other such individuals that are named and must have been high-level members of the inner party, as they are pictured at a party function in New York, and are in the middle of the group with their names captioned in a Times article. It must be a precarious, if powerful, position to hold in the upper echelons of the inner party, as these three men were purged in the 1960s. We can infer that O'Brien is around this level within the inner party too, as he later reveals he participated in the interrogation and curing of these three prominent men. O'Brien also collaborated in writing Goldstein's book, presumably not a task given to just any party member, or perhaps even one of the inner party. Another named and purged individual who likely occupied a high-ranking position in this upper level of the inner party is a comrade named Withers. Withers headed an organisation called FFCC that supplied cigarettes and other comforts to the sailors of the floating fortresses. Withers too is prominent enough to be specially mentioned by Big Brother himself in another Times article, and even awarded the Order of Conspicuous Merit Second Class for his work. Winston is tasked with changing the article, given that Withers is now an unperson, that is, vaporized, theorizes that Big Brother may have ordered his disgrace and vaporization given his popularity in the party. As with any ruling elite then, it's clear that purges and political rivalries exist even within the stringent and devoted ranks of the upper levels of the inner party. As a broad class, the inner party make up the rough upper class of Oceanian society, all members presumably occupying a form of leadership position. We can theorize that such positions include heads of important committees, heads of departments within the ministries, high-ranking military officers, members of the Fort Police, and perhaps the more prominent orators. Winston describes them as directing brains. As the rough upper class of Oceanian society, you might suppose they live in luxury. However, compared to the ruling classes of other times and societies, the inner party member actually lives a relatively Spartan life. They are certainly just as scrutinized for signs of heresy and thought crime, if not more so, given their positions at the top of society. Materially speaking, they are better off than the other classes. Significant differences in the quality of their food, personal possessions, the quality of their clothing, etc., do unquestionably set them apart from even outer party members, let alone proles. Julia shows Winston some stolen goods procured by servants of inner party households, which include real coffee, sugar, as well as white bread and jam, delicacies not enjoyed by outer party members who must make do with poor substitutes like saccharin for sugar and vile-tasting artificial coffee. Inner party members also live in large, spacious apartments in cleaner areas, as showcased when Winston visited O'Brien. O'Brien, as a member of his class, also has the conspicuous privilege of being able to switch off the telescreen in his apartment for small amounts of time, and serves Winston and Julia wine, something Winston has only dreamed of sampling beforehand. O'Brien too as is normal for a member of the inner party, also has at least one servant named Martin, though Goldstein's book makes clear each inner party member has around 2 or 3. Private transport is also a normal perk of this oligarchical class, with members effectively owning cars and even helicopters. So how does one become a member of the inner party? Well, if you are a member of the unwashed masses known as the proles, then you're out of luck, as in principle there's very little movement between the classes, though some movement, as we shall soon explain, is allowed. Generally, no prole is allowed admittance into either branch of the party. However, if it was required for some reason, the party would certainly select from the class in extreme circumstances to repopulate itself. Children of party members are examined at the age of 16, though it's not stated in detail what this examination involves. We can put our speculative hat on and reasonably be sure that such an examination is not purely intellectual. Yes, the examined are likely vigorously vetted for signs of potential heretical tendencies, with only the most solid, good thinkful specimens considered for admittance into the inner party elite. I suspect too that other tests are designed to weed out those of a weak constitution or temperament. Perhaps 16-year-old party kids are given their own Room 101-like scenario, where they are tasked with killing or purging a subject to prove their devotion to BB and party ideals. However, I must stress this is purely speculation on my part. What we definitely do know is that birth, race and gender play no part in selection to the inner party. Quote, "Nor is there any racial discrimination or any marked domination of one province by another. Jews, Negroes, South Americans of pure Indian blood are to be found in the highest ranks of the party, and the administrators of any area are always drawn from the inhabitants of that area." This system of admittance is actually useful in maintaining the power of the party, and particularly the inner party itself, as it allows the more suitable and ambitious elements of the outer party to rise into the inner party, while also presumably excluding those children of inner party members deemed weak or unsuitable in some other way to rule. Logically, since we know that proles are not admitted into either branch of the party as a rule, we can assume that membership of the party at a broader level is hereditary. Broadly, children of party members become party members, though those who fail even to qualify at the outer party level are presumably exiled into the ranks of the proletariat, or even eliminated. The outer party is much larger than the inner party, comprising about 13% of the total population of Oceania. In the book, they are likened to the hands of the society, while the inner party is the brain. As with the inner party, it's reasonable to assume that the outer party also has strata within it too. Though all party members are in theory equal and referred to as comrades, some stations and jobs are likely more sought after than others. Winston himself works in the records department at the Ministry of Truth. His job is to rectify public records to conform to current party dictates and thought. All skilled jobs are likely taken by outer party members, under the direction of inner party members, of course. Some positions require no particular skill or intelligence, however, a fact we know from Winston's description of Parsons. The outer party arguably occupies the worst level of the Oceanian hierarchy, though they are in theory a rough middle class. They are materially set apart from both the inner party and the proles beneath them for different reasons. While comrades do usually have their own flats, they are dilapidated and dirty compared to the dwellings of inner party members, though very likely better than the dwellings of proles in general. Winston also demonstrates he has the money to indulge himself at times. He purchases the paperweight on a whim from Mr. Charrington. He can also afford to rent the room above Mr. Charrington's shop. All this while Winston himself admits that around a quarter of an outer party member's income must be earmarked for voluntary donations. Winston also purchases the services of a prostitute, though this appears to be a relatively rare expense. It's safe to say then that, monetarily, the outer party is set above the prole class too. Outer party members also possess a social status apart from the proles. At least two characters refer to Winston as a gent or gentleman, Mr. Charrington and the old prole in the pub. To link this more clearly to social status, the old man also describes a higher class man with whom he had had an altercation as a gent too. In addition, two prole women quieten and eye Winston with hostility as he passes, Winston thinking that the sight of the blue overalls of a party member must be rare in that part of town. Despite all of this, however, the outer party, as the class with the intellect and power, if unmanaged, to overthrow the inner party, is heavily monitored and controlled. Telescreens are installed in homes to both bombard listeners with constant state propaganda and announcements, while it also records the inhabitant. Telescreens also dog almost every movement of outer party members, with large screens in public places as well as screens in workplaces. Hidden microphones are also ubiquitous. Julia theorizes that though no telescreen likely exists in their first hiding place, there may still be microphones among the trees, even in a remote spot outside of London. As befits a totalitarian society like Oceania, all aspects of the outer party's life is scrutinized, from facial expressions to the gait and way a person walks, or even how a back looks. Any indication of thought crime or eccentricity will likely be noted and the offending individual arrested for processing in the Ministry of Love or transferred to a forced labour camp. Another aspect of life rigidly controlled is personal relationships. Given the outer party is heavily infiltrated with spies and surveillance, it's practically impossible for friendships or any close relationships to form based on a mutual distrust between any two individuals. We can see this in the relationship between Winston and Syme. Though the two get along, especially when Winston can get him to focus on the subject of newspeak, Syme's area of expertise, Winston is also perfectly aware that even a slight indication of his own heresy and hatred of Big Brother would cause his friend to denounce him immediately and without thought. In the intimate realm, things are no better. Party girls are conditioned to merely submit to husbands without enjoyment or love. The sole purpose of marriage is to beget children for service to Big Brother and the party. A love affair in the heavily controlled class of the outer party is almost unthinkable given the risks. Any deviation from the strict rules on relationships results in arrest and likely eventual death for both thought and sex crime. Even the natural bonds between children and parents are warped to serve the interests of the party and social cohesion. Children are routinely inducted into the spies, where they are taught to suspect adults, and especially their own parents. A full dedication to Big Brother and the party is built in them. Many children end up denouncing parents or relatives suspected of heretical tendencies. With relationships and sex closed off from them, outer party members are also totally managed on a physical level, with very little time to think or partake in any activity not involving the party in some way. Daily exercise regimes are normal. An outer party member's time is mostly monopolised by mandatory voluntary services, such as Julia's posting of anti-sex league posters across London in her free time, or Parsons preparing his housing block's decorations for Hate Week. Lectures, community activities and voluntary work, apart from their normal job, take up a broad swathe of an outer party member's time, leaving them very little opportunity to think too deeply on anything, let alone partake in an activity not related to the party. We can almost certainly assume that curfews are in place too. Movement, even within provinces, is also monitored for outer party members. Winston feels uncomfortable even roving the streets of London apart from his usual route home. noting that patrols generally look for party members in prole districts and will demand their papers and an explanation for their presence there. The outer party to which Winston Smith belongs is thus the most heavily oppressed level of Oceanian society, though it's important to stress that members of the inner party are not immune from the demands of their society either. Finally, at the base of the hierarchical pyramid of Oceanian society are the proles. Short for proletarians, these are the vast majority, or around 85% of citizens. These men and women do the menial and low-paying jobs and live in even more horrid material conditions than the average party member. Such is the poverty of prole society that Winston notes that there are many women of the class willing to sell themselves even for a bottle of gin. Proles are broadly described as the low in Goldstein's book, the lower class of Oceanian society. Winston explains that they generally live in large families, mostly marrying young. They are middle-aged by 30 and generally die around the age of 60. Quote, heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbours, films, football, beer, and above all gambling build up the horizon of their minds. To keep them in control was not difficult. A few agents of the Fort Police moved always among them, spreading false rumours, marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. Proles are judged as politically harmless and so not as rigidly controlled by the party. Few proles have telescreens in their homes. It's implied by Mr. Charrington that they are available to them, as he deems them too expensive when Winston points out he doesn't have one. They are to an extent still subject to party control through propaganda. They can generally be relied upon to congregate at public executions and events, a primitive patriotism and hatred stirred in them by constant moulding of public consciousness in the media. All forms of media are totally controlled by the party. Even songs gleefully and ignorantly chanted by proles are created artificially, and even the lowest kind of porn is mechanically created, distributed among the proles, though the consumers are mostly deluded into thinking such things are illegal and illicit. Since all news and contact with foreigners is heavily controlled, the masses have no definitive standard of comparison with which to gauge their own condition. They are also broadly uneducated and without general ideas on which to fixate, even when they are riled up into discontentment sometimes. Though they live in crushing poverty then, the proles are deemed mostly beneath suspicion. Another key form of control is fear. War is continuous, with the proles constantly hit by rocket bombs, which Julia suspects are fired by the government of Oceania itself. Indeed, this seems tacitly confirmed when attacks actually increase up to hate week. These attacks keep this crushed class in a constant state of fear. It stokes hatred for the enemy supposedly behind the attacks, while also driving their devotion to Big Brother and patriotism towards their own state. Though materially much worse off than party members at both levels, it's clear proles enjoy a near normal degree of freedoms. Unlike marriage between party members, divorce is acceptable among proles. In fact, promiscuity is unimportant among them, in stark contrast to the sexual puritanism of the party. Even religious worship would have been permitted if they needed it. Proles appear to be a society apart, though it's probably more proper to apply this label to the smaller party structure apart from it. Criminality is rife, quote, a whole world within a world of thieves, bandits, prostitutes, drug peddlers and racketeers of every description existed. As with other characteristics of prole society, even this criminality is ignored by the party, the civil police only lightly managing the population, and even, it seems, favouring the prole criminals above the party ones. Winston noting later on that a hierarchy existed within the forced labour camps too, with a sort of aristocracy formed by the worst prole criminals and all the dirty jobs performed by the party members. Proles, are allowed to largely live self-governed, adhering to their own codes of conduct, being born, living, breeding, and dying under the apathetic rule of the party. The year is 1984, and the country we know as the UK is under the totalitarian rule of the party, under the ideology of INGSOC, short for English Socialism. Britain has been relegated to the status of a province known as Airstrip 1. The party rules one of the three superstates called Oceania. Unlike in our own world, the name covers much more territory, with the United States having amalgamated with the British Empire in the years following World War II. Oceania then expanded further to encompass South America, Southern Africa, Australia, and the surrounding lands. Airstrip 1 is but one province of this vast empire, and the third most populous. Within Airstrip 1, the plot is set mostly within London, still referred to as such, but a run-down, dirty place, full of antiquated and decaying buildings. Though formerly the capital of an independent UK, London is not the capital of Oceania. Indeed, Oceania has no capital city. Its leader's physical location is never divulged, and the only unifying aspect of the superstate is that English is its lingua franca and Newspeak its official language. This decentralisation, in which each province exists as, in theory, equally important, with its leaders drawn from that area, is a deliberate policy to avoid feelings of colonisation or alienation, which may contribute towards possible revolt and thus an end to the party's dominion. Yet the party and Oceania do not exist alone. Around the same time Oceania emerged, the superstate of Eurasia also came into being, its permanent borders stretching from Portugal to the Bering Strait, as a result of Russia absorbing mainland Europe and much of Asia after the Second World War. The third and smallest of the three superstates, East Asia, took around another decade to form following this, after years of confused fighting, and settled into its permanent borders containing China, Indochina, the Korean Peninsula, as well as the Japanese home islands. Each superstate, as described in 1984's in-universe book, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, is effectively a self-contained universe, each population heavily constrained from contacting the others, and under the dominion of a totalitarian party. In Oceania, of course, the reigning ideology is INSOC, while in Eurasia it is known as Neo-Bolshevism. Third and finally, a similar party rules in East Asia under the philosophy of death worship, or more accurately, the ideology of obliteration of the South. Though named differently, however, the essential structure of each is practically indistinguishable. Most of the people within these superstates are proles or non-party members, essentially the crushed and poverty-riven masses who labour and breed to sustain the economic life of each territory. In each, there is a party equivalent, and extrapolating from the book, in which we know the party is divided into an inner and outer party, we can surmise a similar structure exists in both Eurasia and East Asia. Around 13% of the population of Oceania are outer party members, effectively the skilled or civil servant class, who execute the policies of the directing brains of the state, collectively known as the inner party, comprising just 2% of the population. At the apex of each society and state sits Big Brother or his equivalent. Around each figurehead, a cult of personality is maintained, the book explaining that, quote, Big Brother's function is to act as a focusing point for love, fear, and reverence, emotions which are more easily felt towards an individual than towards an organisation. While on the surface this lack of ideological difference may indicate a peaceful coexistence, the truth is anything but. Warfare within the 1984 universe has become continuous and limited. Since each superstate operates under a similar ideological structure, each requires a permanent state of conflict to maintain its party's hegemony indefinitely. An endless state of limited warfare maintains the strict hierarchical structure of each society, while also wasting vast resources and manpower, that would otherwise be channeled into areas that improve the general well-being for their populations. Like mutually supporting legs of a tripod, even if desired, each superstate cannot really be conquered even by a combination of the other two. Oceania's core territories are protected by the vast Atlantic Pacific Oceans, while the sheer enormity of the Eurasian landmass makes conquest unlikely. East Asia too is insulated from such a fate by the sheer size and industriousness of its population. By the year 1984 in the novel, warfare between each superstate has been largely limited to smaller numbers of professional troops and in disputed areas, as represented by rough quadrilateral area, its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin and Hong Kong. Though particular areas within the disputed zone do have valuable resources and vast numbers of effective slaves that periodically change hands between the powers, in truth, each superstate is effectively self-sufficient already. In keeping with the principle of doublethink, the leaders of each state both understand and suppress their understanding that the war is unwinnable, or more accurately, the war is not meant to be won, but maintained to create the war atmosphere necessary to maintain each of these self-contained totalitarian societies. Despite inherently understanding that the war must be maintained, continuous, and so not won, even if this were somehow possible, the members of the inner party are yet the most fanatical members of Oceanian society in their fervent belief that world conquest and the destruction of both opposing superstates is an inevitability. The war thus shifts continuously and has done so for the past 2 decades up to Winston's time, Oceania allying with either Eurasia or East Asia against the other, waging endless, limited war in the disputed zone, while likely launching rockets into its own territory, or at least allowing such attacks to create the siege mentality conducive to their totalitarian hierarchical societies, and thus affect a maintenance of their power for the sake of exercising that power. So there we have it, the geopolitical map of Orwell's 1984. The 3 major powers are Oceania, Eurasia and East Asia, with the territory of the disputed zone essentially a necessary and endless crucible of warfare, particular parts changing masters every now and then. In George Orwell's 1984, doublethink is the core mental process that binds the minds of party members to the party. It is essential in maintaining the rule of Big Brother and the party, with failure to apply it leading to thought crime and death. Welcome to 1984 Law, and today we briefly consider doublethink, what it is and some conspicuous examples of it in the book. We shall begin by recalling a lengthy but important quote from the novel. Quote, "Doublethink means the power of holding 2 contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. The party intellectual knows in which direction his memories must be altered. He therefore knows that he is playing tricks with reality, but by the exercise of doublethink he also satisfies himself that reality is not violated. The process has to be conscious, or it would not be carried out with sufficient precision, but it also has to be unconscious, or it would bring with it a feeling of falsity and hence of guilt. Doublethink lies at the very heart of ingsoc, since the essential act of the party is to use conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty. To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, to forget any fact that had become inconvenient, and then, when it becomes necessary again, to draw it back from oblivion, but just so long as it is needed, to deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of the reality which one denies. All this is indispensably necessary. Even in using the word doublethink, it is necessary to exercise doublethink, for by using the word, one admits that one is tampering with reality. By a fresh act of doublethink, one erases this knowledge, and so on indefinitely, with the lie always one leap ahead of the truth. Ultimately, it is by means of doublethink that the party has been able, and may, for all we know, continue to be able for thousands of years to arrest the course of history. To summarise then, Doublethink is the act of concurrently holding in one's mind two opposing mutually exclusive ideas and believing in both without question. One example of this is in the common attitude party members have towards proles, those masses of working class non-party members that comprise about 85% of Oceania's population. According to party history, the revolution liberated the proles, rising against the capitalists to ensure a better life for them. In superficially aligning themselves with the working class, party members even use old socialist terminology like comrade and brother, and wear attire that is traditionally peculiar to working class folk in their blue and black overalls. However, despite all of this, the proles are also held to be natural inferiors, if even human at all. They are in practice not equals and controlled through pervasive party propaganda, the thought police, and a crushing poverty and warfare largely imposed on them by the government of Oceania itself. On the issue of the proles then, they are both held to be comrades, equals and allies, while simultaneously derided as mindless, inhuman drudges, naturally inferior to party members. For the orthodox party member, however, the simple exercise of doublethink, or reality control as it's known in old speak or standard English, easily enables them to process this contradiction. Another example that particularly disgusts Winston is in the Part 1 canteen scene. Winston himself, as an employee within the records department, was perfectly aware that the choco ration had been reduced from 30 grams to 20 grams just recently, and yet following a bellicose announcement of military triumph, the telescreen reframed the change as an increase of the ration to 20 grams. Winston considers this. Quote, "Only yesterday," he reflected, "it had been announced that the ration was to be reduced to 20 grams a week. Was it possible that they could swallow that after only 24 hours? Yes, they swallowed it. Parsons swallowed it easily, with the stupidity of an animal." Unfortunately for Winston, given the heavy mental grip it exercises over everyone, and the culture of fear cultivated by the party, he can never be sure that anybody outside of himself also remembers the reduction. And so though Winston is perfectly aware that any rational, thinking person knows the ration was in fact reduced, there is always doubt, and if only he doubted, then he could very well be wrong. With Winston, it's clear something went wrong, or right, we may say, earlier on in life. Perhaps he was not sufficiently schooled in the method of doublethink from an early enough age. Perhaps a sufficiently curious or inquisitive mind is simply more impervious to the process. Intellect, it seems, has no real bearing on matters. Syme is cited by Winston as a good practitioner of doublethink, while also possessing great intelligence. Another obvious example of masterful practice of doublethink in conjunction with great intellect is O'Brien, who later on destroys the photograph proving Jones, Aronson and Rutherford's innocence, and then apparently instantly forgets that he had done so, and then also the very act of forgetting itself. Remaining with O'Brien and the inner party, it's also true to say that, given their importance as administrators and leaders, members of the inner party are particularly good practitioners of doublethink. Quote, "It is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, and he may often be aware that the entire war is spurious, and is either not happening, or is being waged for purposes quite other than the declared ones. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inner party member wavers for an instant in his mythical belief that the war is real, and that it is bound to end victoriously, with Oceania the undisputed master of the entire world." I think, given O'Brien's thoughts later on with his conversations with Winston, we can easily translate this to other areas too. On the former choco ration example, of course, any inner party member will be furtively aware of the reduction, but through doublethink and their unspoken belief that truth is the collective party truth, this fact can be easily discarded if inconvenient. Given doublethink as a mechanism of control almost exclusively relies on the isolation of individual minds and the resultant doubt that reinforces party truth. We can theorise that given enough communication between those who reject the party truth, cracks would inevitably undermine the party's mental grip over society. What does this mean? Well, it's clear that doublethink works after a fashion, given that any party member is so constrained as to never openly question the particular concept or truth in question, or to confirm something different with another party member. No one in that canteen, for instance, would have dared openly question the choco ration announcement. Interestingly, we do have at least one minor example where there is slight questioning of a more innocent kind. Winston notes that following Syme's disappearance, in actual fact his vaporization, a few thoughtless people asked about his absence. The following day, however, the effect was absolute, and not a single voice was raised questioning his whereabouts. Since party members can never openly confer between themselves outside of the eyes and ears of the thought police, the shadow of doubt always casts itself on the individual. This is likely a truth that is apparent to Winston. Indeed, he becomes quite distressed when Julia fails to recall that until just a few years before, Oceania had been at war with the other great enemy. He makes a determined effort to help Julia remember the change, but it's difficult, and her forgetting the change was obviously distressing for him. This may also be why the particular mode of resistance against Big Brother and the party, as prescribed in Goldstein's book, is the spread of knowledge from individual to individual and generation to generation. With this gradual reduction of general doubt and a rival standard of checking one's reality, the process of doublethink must also weaken and so undermine party control. Though O'Brien wrote the book and dismisses this plan as nonsense, it's difficult to discard such a plan given what we know about how doublethink works. So, that was a few thoughts on doublethink. Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we focus on telescreens, one of the more infamous instruments of control in George Orwell's nightmare world of Oceania. Telescreens are one of the essential elements of the party's total control in the superstate of Oceania. It was really with the invention of it that private life effectively came to an end, and the near total surveillance of all party members began. Telescreens both transmit and receive simultaneously, with any sound louder than a low whisper being picked up, and the screen itself enabling a wide field of vision to snoop on party members. The technology had not developed to the point of recording in darkness, which gave a small window of privacy if the comrade remained quiet at night. However, totally escaping the incessant propaganda and programming was impossible. Outer party members not only endured their presence at work and in any public place outside of remote country areas, but also had to accept their own allocated telescreen in their own homes. Winston notes that telescreens were usually placed on the wall that commanded the best field of vision, though sometimes, as was the case with his, placement can sometimes create blind spots where a comrade can escape its gaze. In the novel, Victory Square is said to be full of telescreens. The corridor down which Winston both receives Julia's love note and is also approached by O'Brien also had one. Winston later reveals too that telescreens are ever present in toilets when he considers reading Julia's note in there. Unsurprisingly too, in Winston's cell, a telescreen occupies all four walls. In more rural areas, such as the so-called Golden Country, in which Winston and Julia began their love affair, telescreens are likely few and far between. However, even so, Julia does suspect that even out there could be places where microphones are hidden. Winston was also fairly certain that no microphones were present during his earlier hiking trip with his wife Catherine, let alone any telescreens. Their reach then does seem to have limits. Indeed, to think that such devices could be installed to visually monitor every outside and public space is practically impossible. No outer party telescreen can be turned off, and the volume can only be dimmed and not muted, meaning that presumably even throughout the night, programming would continue, and during the day more vociferous announcements and programming would bruise the ears with statistics, songs and other party propaganda. One issue of controversy regarding telescreens is whether inner-party members can really switch them off. Assuming this was a genuine privilege, demonstrated by O'Brien in his meeting with Winston and Julia, O'Brien does add that even for comrades of his rank, it was not wise to switch off their telescreen for longer than half an hour. Unfortunately, like much of the lore of the book, we simply don't know if this was a genuine perk of an inner-party member or not. I tend to think not, or if it was, that few inner-party comrades would have been daft enough to exercise it. Having the privilege to turn them off doesn't mean you should. Being able to turn off the telescreen, or at least seem to, was essential for O'Brien's deception at the meeting. Only once Winston's fears regarding it had been assuaged would he fully expose his own thought crime and eagerness to join the Brotherhood, and so it proved. Furthermore, Winston was replayed his own words, confirming what he would do for the Brotherhood later on during his interrogation, these damning statements perhaps recorded by the telescreen. Incidentally, even if inner-party telescreens were fitted with an off switch, to actually use it was probably not wise for obvious reasons. Turning off a telescreen for any amount of time would likely imply some foul play to the watchers. We know that inner-party comrades are not immune from the stringent demands of the party, with some comrades being arrested and vaporized. Jones, Aronson and Rutherford had been purged, as had the less well-known Comrade Withers. An interesting thought to consider is that perhaps the ability to switch them off was real, but that it was more granted as a test than an outright perk. Why would any inner-party member, supposedly the most committed and fanatically loyal adherents to the principles of INGSOC and to Big Brother, ever want to switch off their telescreen? In O'Brien's case, he of course required his to be temporarily switched off, or at least made to appear to be off, in order to trap Winston and Julia. On this particular issue then, I think it's unlikely that the ability to switch them off was genuine, or at the least was intended as another way to root out disloyal persons within the inner party itself. A further common subject regarding telescreens I'd like to address is that the party watches all individuals at all times. Contrary to this common belief, telescreens are only imposed on party members and public spaces. The old problem then of how everyone is watched constantly is quite answerable, with the more plausible task being the surveillance of party members, and even then, likely mostly outer party members. If you're wondering why non-party members are not required to have telescreens in their homes, this is simply down to the belief that the proles are not considered threats. Being too crushed by poverty, distracted by their work, their lives and entertainment, not even mentioning party propaganda, proles are not educated or motivated enough to pose a real threat to the power of the party. At a stroke, this removes around 85% of the population of Oceania from the population of those requiring telescreen surveillance, though even so, this still leaves millions of party members who in theory must be under constant threat of inspection. Practically, it's simply impossible for all party members to be watched all of the time, with the much more likely scenario being that the more publicly placed ones are indeed monitored constantly. Winston believes, for example, that the screens placed in the toilets were likely always watched, though the fact he highlights this also implies that he believes there are others that aren't constantly watched. Another factor here is routine and time. The world of 1984 is very much a place of routine. There's a time for exercise, a time for the hate, a time for eating and so on. Key scheduled announcements and programming would also likely be times that party members would be monitored. During these times, it's likely all party members could conceivably be checked in on, if not watched for too long. The beauty of Orwell's dystopian world is that he always keeps things vague. It's possible then to imagine a more automated system of surveillance in which human watchers were not necessarily required. Of course, I'm not suggesting Orwell specifically envisioned this, but that the ambiguity of his writing does allow for it. Another thing to consider is the potential effect, a term I've just made up. Just because party members know statistically it's quite unlikely they're being closely monitored at any given moment does not mean they can ever know they are being inspected. This creates a culture of self-policing that in itself reduces the need for perpetual monitoring of all comrades to begin with. More likely then, every typical party member can expect to be inspected several times a day for short periods, usually at flashpoints in the day, but can generally be assured at night and other quieter times that they are not. Key times when a comrade could expect to be monitored more than usual, in my opinion, are during exercise routines, at the 2 minutes hate, and in the canteens. It would not surprise me if the telescreen footage of every 2 minutes hate is inspected for potential face crime or any indication of abnormality or such. Certain individuals who have already exhibited signs of thought crime are almost certainly monitored constantly. The best example of this, of course, is Winston himself. Winston was instantly scolded by the instructress for not trying to touch his toes. He was also quickly screamed at to uncover his face and take his hands out of his pockets in the cells. Indeed, it's highly likely most major events in the novel, from Winston's seconds-long lapse in his facial control in the 2 minutes hate, to Julia's staged fall in the corridor, from their mumbled conversation in the canteen following this, to O'Brien's approaching him later on, and much more, were all watched and carefully recorded. If we recall most of the major events carefully, we can see a telescreen was nearly always present. The only time I can think of is Winston and Julia's meeting in the Golden Country. So, if we construct a mini hierarchy of monitoring to finish up, at the very bottom of the pile are proles who require no surveillance, or very minimal surveillance at the most. Inner party members are probably monitored, but given their fanaticism and loyalty, they are regarded as lower risks. The largest group are the subdued ranks of most outer party members. These individuals largely self-police and require some, but not constant inspection. Finally, the much smaller pool of individuals that are under constant surveillance are those outer party members already suspected or exposed as thought criminals. This group will likely number in the thousands across Oceania, but are still manageable. One conspicuous visual detail that even the most casual fan of the 1984 universe can't fail to notice is the distinctive blue and black overalls of the party. But what's the deal here? Why does the elite of oceanic society garb itself in such clothes? Welcome to 1984 lore, and today we consider why the party uniform takes the form of overalls, as we so iconically see, for example, depicted in Radford's 1984 film version of the novel. The most direct answer we have from the lore, and taken straight from Part 2, Chapter 9, is the following. Quote, "The party rejects and vilifies every principle for which the socialist movement originally stood, and it chooses to do this in the name of socialism. It preaches a contempt for the working class unexampled for centuries past, and it dresses its members in a uniform which was at one time peculiar to manual workers, and so was adopted for that reason." This, of course, is an extract taken from Goldstein's book, the in-universe Brotherhood text, actually partially written by O'Brien and used by the party to entrap thought criminals. This is a good answer, however, I think it only partially explains the origins of the uniform, and not the other uses it has for the party. The aforementioned quote implies that, whether cynically or genuinely adopted, the early party used overalls to better relate to and align with the working class, whose support they needed to overthrow the capitalists or high of the time. I suspect that, contrary to many viewers' instincts, including my own at first, that this was likely genuinely adopted very early on. That is to say, the earliest party members probably really were committed to socialist principles, and so by visually representing themselves like this, it didn't hurt their rise or cause. Incidentally, in the same section of the book, we do have some vague details on the type of people who led the party in its early years. Mostly bureaucrats, scientists, technicians, trade union organisers, publicity experts, sociologists, teachers, journalists, and professional politicians. All people from the middle class or upper working class. It had obviously been useful for these early leaders to don such attire to differentiate themselves from the ruling elite. While this is interesting though, I believe the use of overalls evolved into a kind of status symbol, ironically enough in the same vein as a top hat or suit that were associated with the previous high before Ingsoc's rise. We know this from snippets in the novel. For example, Winston notes that two prole women quieten and eye him as he passes, Winston surmising that the blue overalls of a party member could not have been a common sight in their part of London. Outside of their overalls too, we do see other subtle signs of deference, such as Winston being referred to as a gent on occasion, and also as governor by a prole warning him of a rocket attack. Despite the crushing opposition outer party members live through day by day then, their uniform does serve to grant them a degree of status and deference. For the upper rung of oceanic society, this also clearly applies too, as O'Brien's appearance prior to the 2 minutes hate is enough to cause a hush to come over the assembled outer party members at the sight of the black overalls of an inner party member. We can further assume then that on the rare occasions inner party members are even seen by proles, they also provoke a similar and appropriately greater deference, similar to when ordinary folk in our world encounter senior leaders of their government. Interestingly, the differentiation between inner and outer party is clearly designed to emphasise the differing degrees of status within the party, similar to the aforementioned situation between proles and the outer party members. However, that all party members wear the overalls also serves to suppress individuality at all levels too. Given the larger size of the outer party, at around 13% of Oceania's population, the effect is largely, but not exclusively, felt by this branch of the party. Their blue overalls, then, are a daily and constant reminder that they are merely part of the whole, their bodies serving the party, just as their minds should align completely with party truth and the principles of Ingsoc. As a quick aside, given what we know from Goldstein's book, it's very likely the other ideologies of Eurasia and East Asia are similarly embedded in an extreme adherence to collectivism that abhors any deviation into individuality. The East Asian ideology, named obliteration of the self, appears to directly imply this. Indeed, the torture scenes at the novel's conclusion are essentially about Winston's so-called victory over himself, how he is forcibly remoulded to align with the party in both thought and emotion. While most dramatically seen and commonly enforced upon the outer party, the inner party too are certainly not exempt from this suppression of the self. They too must similarly suppress their physical differences within their own uniform. 6 million men and women of Oceania's elite, all wearing the black overalls of the inner party. Indeed, though theory on my part, I do believe that in an important way the dress code is likely even more important to enforce this branch of the party, given the nature of their positions as the effective ruling class, and given the natural ambitions and temptations that come with that. As I've alluded to in past videos, I believe that power struggles still occur even within Oceania's elite. One problem that obviously threatens a system of strictly collective rule is the threat of what I'll call Caesarism, or to use a more classically left-wing term, Bonapartism. We know within the law that the early history of the party saw one huge split early on in the conflict between Big Brother and Goldstein. Winston explains that Goldstein had almost been at a level with BB himself, but had betrayed the revolution and BB. This is, of course, official party history, and so a tale to be heavily scrutinised. But I think there's likely a degree of truth in the story of this split. As the saying goes, the best lies often have a core of truth to them. More likely, Goldstein tried to take the leadership, or had it taken from him. Goldstein, then, could have attempted to become a Napoleon-like figure. The purging of Jones, Aronson and Rutherford was also almost certainly a power struggle of a kind, with Big Brother emerging as the undisputed leader of the party in Oceania by about 1970. Power struggles in the past were not absent then. Comrade Withers, too, a prominent inner-party member that ran a group called FFCC, who supplied cigarettes and other comforts to the men of the floating fortresses, was also purged in Winston's time, as Winston himself believes, because he may have been viewed as a bit too popular for his own good. Clearly then, whether real or imagined, these men and women at the very top of the party are wary of any one of them rising to power above and beyond anybody else. As Goldstein's book explains, when rule of a state is collectivized, it can last for centuries, whereas hereditary systems tend not to. Whether historically true or not, an example to the contrary is perhaps the Roman Empire. What matters is that it's clearly a concern within the inner party to prevent any Caesar or Napoleon-type figure from emerging to take full power and thus threaten the system as a whole. The most conspicuous mechanism preventing this is to at least superficially fill that role of supreme power with Big Brother, who is, in my opinion, merely a facade, as O'Brien himself admits that he is the embodiment of the party, who will never die. However, another obvious way to enforce this spirit and rule of collective power is the black overalls of the elite, suppressing individuality and exceptionalism in this branch of the party too. Yes, as O'Brien's book explains, the inner party uniform is a mark of status and prestige. The materials are even finer than the standard blue overalls of the outer party, but it's still a uniform nonetheless. So what do you think about the uniform of the party? Did I miss anything? Do you agree with my theory on the importance of the uniform at the party's highest level particularly? Drop your thoughts below in the comments section, and I'll see you in the next one.